Damn, I hear the myth. All right. We will get started. We are almost done with this roller coaster of a ride. Let's see. I think Dick Dickens. Let me take this away for a moment. Oh, excuse my mess of books. But like, say hello. Hey, everybody. Kitties are controlling the space. What's up, Mr. Carey? How are you? Saw you over at Vippy's the other day. My amazing propeller. I like that one better than the one that hangs up. Let me take that away again. Lose my work computer. You can post scriptures anytime you want to. I like that one better than that one, even though it has everybody's signature on it. That is, I was at the unit, not like that unit, but the unit. Another the unit. Yeah, but this is again a self-regulating chat, just like uh, over at the Pirate Lab. So, have you dropped any of those songs, Mr. Carey? It's not a problem. I promise. It's not. The problem is I don't have a, sliding ladder bookshelf. So that's the real problem in life. Oh, let me grab something real quick. I want to show you guys that Nomad did for me. As soon as I get some merch up. I'll just do that. Present. Oh. Thoughts, ideas, concerns, comments. I love old books that way, Dick Dickens. This is where I want to start, Nomad. This one in the new G2 logo. Um, well, I mean, the dollar sign. I'm always slacking. The PayPal or the, buy me coffee or whatever that goes to Hefe it all goes to the same, pocketbook. Again, I'm a, for super chats? Yeah, I've been lazy. I'm sorry. It's been terribly, but I'm so close to that. I've got like 400 hours until I can be 100% fully monetized. So, oops, let me close that. Thanks, Dick. Freddie. Yeah, I see. I don't think about these things. You're the peddler on the roof. Those as old as or older than me will get that one. If I were a rich man, debba 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 do. One of my favorites, by the way. Okay. All right, let's get started, shall we? Because a lot of people are over watching Josh and Top. All right, we're about done. By the way, this may be the last chapter. Chapter 14. The touchy feely guys, touchy feely tough guys. I wouldn't know anything about those types of people. It was a rite of passage. It was not a cure. It allowed me to be just a little bit happier. It probably saved my life, but it's not a fairy tale ending. Marine Staff Sergeant, 2 combat tours, former patient at the Moral Injury Group, Naval Medical Center, San Diego. No, I just didn't know whether to say SV or Josh. It was a brain self edit. All right. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had been underway for some time before the mental health community was able to begin grappling seriously with the puzzle of moral injury. That was plaguing new veterans like Brad Ruther and Darren Dawes. But by 2005, the foundations were being laid for understanding moral injury, for separating it from PTSD. Yeah, don't forget the lick button. We always prefer the licks. Let's see. For understanding moral injury, for separating it from PTSD. Bill Nash had returned from his tour in Iraq, determined to find a better way to deal with his combat stress. At the Boston VA Medical Center, Brett Litz was continuing a decade of work trying to define the varieties of trauma that the troops experienced in war. and to gain insights into the mechanisms and treatment of these psychological injuries. Eventually, they would collaborate on a new kind of therapy designed specifically for moral injury. At the Marine base at Camp Pendleton, meantime, an innovative form of treatment for moral injury was being pioneered by someone who was neither a psychiatrist nor a psychologist. It was a kid who grew up in a blue collar family outside Boston, the third of four children of Anna and Carmelo Castellana, a hardworking World War II veteran. The future therapist was his son, Michael, who had been relentlessly bullied in their working class neighborhood for being smart and a sensitive and gay for being, oh, I said being gay, smart, and sensitive. That didn't make sense. For being smart and sensitive and gay, who lived through deeply troubling trauma as a young man, who discovered that teaching teenagers and gays and lesbians to express themselves through drama could help them deal with their own personal difficulties, and who eventually, after doctoral level training in psychotherapy, was hired as a therapist for combat hardened Marines at Camp Pendleton. Michael Castiana arrived in 2005, determined to do something about to ease the pain and anger of Marines returning from combat. A woman staffer at Pendleton heard that Michael was coming. She thought, a gay man? They'll eat him alive. Then she met Michael and thought he was perfect. Castiana had the intuitive grasp of what Marines were feeling and knew from his treatment of other traumatized people how to draw them out and help them. He won the trust of the Marines within a year, had written a manual for the treatment of what the Marine Corps called combat stress. In truth, it was treatment for what would be later recognized as moral injury. After a couple of years working as a therapist at Pendleton, Castiano one day opened his office door to a Marine he didn't know. You know, I've heard about you, the Marine said. People are talking, Castiano said. Yeah. Oh, yeah, the Marine said. Are you ready for this? They call you the touchy feely tough guy. You're tough as nails, but you love people, Castiana said. I'm good with that. Castiano, in his late 50s, has wide, penetrating eyes, a neat salt and pepper beard, and an open manner that invites easy and thoughtful conversation. He and I were talking over breakfast at an outdoor cafe in San Diego, enjoying the spring flowers blossoming in the cool morning air. When he first got to Pendleton, Michael said he didn't find it easy going. Marines did come and see him and would want to talk in individual therapy sessions. But like Nick Rudolph at Camp Lejeune, many were reluctant to join group sessions. That, Michael thought, were more effective. Eventually, he would persuade them to take part, and once they got used to being in a group, they couldn't stop talking. No, I can't. Ruff's butt phone. Some of what had to say, the experiences they wanted to get off their chest, was jolting. I used to tell my Marines, I don't scare easily, which is a crock of shit, of course, but I would let them tell me anything, Castiana told me. I've heard the most heinous things that humans can do to other human beings. Stuff to make your toes curl. but in my capacity to love them and to see that in an effort to do what is right, they sometimes do something so wrong. Their goodness seems to be intact, and I seem to be able to connect with that. If they were in my office, if they were talking to me, then they were capable of redemption. As the waitress hovered, he broke off. 2 eggs over easy, please. Over light, she corrected. Right, he said gently. You turn them over and take them out of the pan. One key insight that struck Castiana was that the seeds of forgiveness would come not from him or any outsider. They could only come from the Marine's peers. On that, he diverged sharply from Chaplain Etter's insistence on the primary role of a spiritual leader. But Castiano built the central role of peers into his model for 12 sessions of moral injury repair. Forgiveness was a critical piece of that therapy. He knew, but a lot of work would have to come first. Combat veterans who have done or seen something awful are often afraid of being shamed or rejected by their peers. Worse, that they'd be made fun of. Those fears would have to be overcome. Michael saw the bad comma transition, but okay. The opportunity for forgiveness from the group and from the individual would come late in the 12 sessions when a Marine would feel safe and comfortable and could find the courage to speak of his trauma, to relate something awful he or she had seen or done. And the Marine's peers in the room would be ready to accept that without judgment. I nodded as Michael was describing this moment. Somewhere I had heard the phrase listening with validation. Understood that to mean what I've often tried to do as a reporter, listening without judgment, but accepting the weight of a person's story. Listening to Nick Rudolph, for instance, talking about killing the child. I was tempted to say, oh, don't worry about it. You couldn't help it. It was war. He was shooting at you. All true, of course. But as Nick was struggling toward forgiving himself, not a helpful response. He'd already rejected those flimsy excuses. Killing a child was just wrong. No way around that. As Bill Nash would say, no way to unring that bell. To validate Nick's experience, to recognize it as something hard and real, the best approach was a phrase I'd adopted from the Marines. Yeah, that was fucked up. Notice that it doesn't affix blame. It doesn't excuse either. It makes room for other factors. The kid you shot is partly to blame. He was shooting at you. It allows for acceptance and forgiveness. I guess he feels all emboldened, Hill Pirate, given his hard hitting interview with the veteran. Made him feel all tingly inside. In Castiana's group, one staff sergeant kept warning that he had something, that it was coming, that he wanted to tell the story. And Castiana kept saying, not now, not now, the time will come. And finally, around the sixth session, the time came and the staff sergeant talked about how he had tortured prisoners. It was bad. It was fucked up. He spoke with his head bowed, eyes to the ground. The group sat in silence. When the staff sergeant was finished, Castellana said to him, "You were so concerned about what people would think. Why don't you take a moment and look into the eyes of all the other group members?" And he did that. He was really trying, Michael said. Father of three, and I asked him, "What do you see?" And he said, "Well, I didn't see anyone look at me differently." He said, "I think I'm not the only one here with a story like this." Imagine the weight lifted off his shoulders. "I'm getting shivers just telling you this," Castellana said to me as our eggs arrived. His were overlight. Around the time that Castellana was engaging with Marines at Camp Pendleton, Brett Litz, who is an energetic man with a close cropped gray beard, a gravity defying tangle of red hair, and a perpetual look of doubting skepticism, was bringing the cold eye of science to what had long been the muddled business of treating war trauma. From the outside, Litz seems an unlikely pioneer in wartime trauma. He didn't grow up in a military family or even near a military community. Came of age in the 70s in Seacliff, New York, a prosperous and picturesque village along Long Island Sound. He was drawn into the academic world at North Shore High School, working and getting high with teachers who encouraged rigorous intellectual discussions on first name bases. Excited by this, he kind of academic probing, Litz enrolled at nearby Stony Brook University, which happened to be a hotbed of an emergent form of psychotherapy called behavioral therapy. Behavioral therapy was a sharp change from the Freudian idea that mental illness sprang from an unresolved childhood trauma. It was Freud's theory that lay behind the conviction held by many psychologists in World War I that anyone suffering from shell shock simply had unresolved childhood issues, and the soldier could be treated briefly and sent back into battle. That's where we talked about enjoy a picturesque day, Jeff. It's pretty nice. Was on my couple of walks already today. So that being sent back into battle, remember the psychiatrist that took soldiers, put them in, fed them real good, let them sleep for as long as they needed. I think up to 30 days they had in a picturesque environment, and then sent them back into the battle. Anyway, that approach continued into the 1960s and 70s when psychologists began working around the theory that abnormal behavior wasn't a leftover childhood problem after all. It was learned and could be unlearned through a variety of different therapeutic models. Cognitive behavioral therapy and a variant, cognitive processing therapy, had the therapist and patient working together to articulate, understand, and challenge distorted and destructive thoughts. Something bad happened to me, therefore I must be a bad person. Yes, the basement that I reside in, 50 steps up. Or do you mean Hefe? And to replace them with more positive self concepts. Behavioral therapy was exciting because it promised a more immediate and practical problem solving approach to mental distress. But what caught Litz's skeptical eye were the dozens of scientific and clinical trials that seemed to prove behavioral therapies to be effective. Spider Dog, what's up? Litz waded into this work with zeal. He trained as a psychologist in exposure therapy, eesh, a form of behavioral therapy in which patients are asked to repeat in detail, sorry, glasses, in detail their most traumatic experiences. Unlike critical incident stress debriefing, which relies on one immediate session to share stories, exposure therapy centers on re experiencing trauma over and over to the point there where it will lose its power. I'm not saying it don't work, but I'm saying it don't work for everybody. And the anxiety or dread produced by the experience will fade and become extinguished. The problem, Letts soon realized, was that when people were asked to recount a troubling or shameful episode, most of them shaded the truth. It was the same thing with Castiana, was encouraging encountering in his sessions with Marines. When they were given an opportunity to talk about what was troubling them, they'd often pick something minor at first. The hard, black stuff would come out later when they had the chance to try out a story in group, and it didn't blow up on them. For most people, it's what they are willing or able to tell you, Let's said. You have to do some detective work, and you can't assume that what you're being told is all there is to the story. All there is to the story, sorry. He said, often gets in the way. That got him interested in the phenomenon called emotional numbing or social detachment, now considered a symptom of PTSD and moral injury, a way to bury unpleasant or traumatic emotions by simply avoiding contact with others. Woohoo! Introversion. It was very poorly defined. What the hell was it? Depression or something else? Let's wondered. I spent 2 or 3 years putting a scientific lens on it. By that time, in 1987, he was working with VA Medical Center in Boston, engaging with patients, but his real love was the research, figuring out and demonstrating not just what works, but why. He found the VA a great culture for innovation, a lot of creativity. Probably been fired by now, you know, Doge and all. Thank you, Boston. And hello. So nobody objected when, in the early 1990s, he got interested in the mental health problems experienced by U.S. troops returning from peacekeeping operations in Somalia. We know how that went. He led a team that examined 3,500 recently returned soldiers for signs of PTSD, which at the time was considered the overall explanation for every kind of war trauma. War trauma was thought to be caused solely by fear. Fear dysregulation, psychologists called it. They understood that military personnel exposed to peril often develop acute anxiety, insomnia, or nightmares, a startle reflex, all of it caused by fear. You went into harm's way, had a terrifying experience. you got PTSD. The VA knew how to diagnose PTSD and treat it. Litz wanted to know more. What the hell was it? And in the course of the research project, he found something that would drive decades of his work on moral injury. The rate of diagnosed PTSD among troops who'd served in Somalia was small but significant. That amount of trauma was understandable, given that the soldiers and Marines, when sent to Somalia, had been plunged into the midst of a bloody civil war in which Islamist extremist fighters, the forerunners of Al Qaeda and ISIS, were making their first murderous appearances. Litz and his colleagues found that about 8% of the U.S. troops had symptoms of PTSD. But why? Fear alone couldn't explain it. This had been a peacekeeping mission, and the rate of PTSD was below the contemporary estimates for Vietnam combat veterans, 10%, and Gulf War veterans, 14%. Wow, that seems pretty crazy high for the Gulf War vets. No shade, but a little. The more Litz thought about it, the more he felt the explanation of PTSD and the therapies designed for it were too thin. Here was a puzzle. If PTSD was fear based, as the psychiatry profession declared, if war trauma was caused by one's reaction to a terrifying incident, why was it so prevalent among well trained American troops engaged in a peacekeeping operation? Ask the people that came back from Bosnia. We haven't heard anything about that. And let me tell you from the feeds I got back during that conflict, uh, it was brutal. After all, the military had done its best to inoculate its troops against fear. Service members were pre-selected for physical and mental acuity. Low grades on physical fitness and intelligence tests disqualified many applicants from enlisting. Those who were accepted were relentlessly trained in grueling combat exercises and supported by close intimates who served together over time in small units. That was thanks to a deliberate shift in the military personnel policy made in the early 1980s that bolstered unit cohesion by abandoning the Vietnam era practice of moving soldiers around individually among units instead of keeping them together for years. The peer support that developed together with the military's effective small unit leadership ought to be enough to enable soldiers to recover from dangerous experiences, Litz thought. Then why were the peacekeepers showing up with symptoms of trauma? In a nearly accurate preview of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, in findings published in 1996, he concluded that American troops in Somalia were disoriented and troubled by ambiguous, inconsistent, and unacceptable rules of engagement, lack of clarity about the goals of the mission itself, a civilian population of combatants, and inherently contradictory experiences of the mission as both humanitarian and dangerous. Somalia, he wrote, seems to be the prototype of a new paradigm in military operations. One that may represent a unique class of potentially traumatizing experiences not sufficiently captured by traditional descriptors of war zone exposure. In other words, the troops were reacting emotionally to morally difficult circumstances. Their PTSD symptoms weren't entirely driven by fear, and those circumstances, let's felt certain, would appear again and again. The confusing row, right? We're asked to do things that work miracles in a constrictive environment. We saw this in Iraq and Afghanistan after phase 3 operations had begun. Phase 1 and 2 was easy. It was like go kill them. Um, then you get into phase 3 operations, and it was chaos. Um, because you did have a not fear. What? you you took the words out of my mouth. I was just trying to word it up a little bit. But the population is all potential combatants. From the age they're old enough to pick up a gun or put two wires together. Um, Everyone's a shield. Um, you get blamed for things that, um, if you're taking out a high value target and there's collateral damage. So you have this anxiety, this constant anxiety. Um, uh, Leadership changing on you in an instant, even during an operation. They're not. They're changing the rules on you, right? So you don't know what you're doing is within the row or not. Sometimes, anyway. Something else began to bug Litz. The treatment offered by the VA for war trauma had come out of the civilian world, and specifically for therapies designed for people who had suffered a one time trauma or victimization, such as rape. Easiest path, yes, sir. And they'll take your try to steal your valor or at least downgrade it for their own purposes, right? But hey, if you're a general, you can put yourself in for a silver star for being in the talk. So we talked about this, how I think, and this is not necessarily consensus that um, combat PTSD for people who have multiple deployments is more like complex PTSD than it is like a one-time PTSD. Yep, they'll tell you they served valorously, and how dare you uh, question a real veteran. Tested exhaustively in clinical trials, these were known as evidence-based approaches. Cognitive behavioral therapies, which Litz had mastered at Stony Brook, were effective in extinguishing the lingering fear in cases of rape, motorcycle accidents, and similar traumas. Sweet Melissa, a living one, yes, especially on Memorial Day. So let's see. The label, evidence based, was kind of a marketing seal of approval, like a TV ad phrased laboratory tested. So, why were those same therapies less effective in clinical trials with veterans diagnosed with PTSD? Angel Gamer, how are you? What Litz was learning from the veterans he was seeing at the Boston VA pointed toward part of the answer. The therapies weren't wrong, the diagnoses were incorrect. Their distress wasn't caused by fear stemming from a life threatening incident, but also from emotionally and morally disturbing incidents in war. Often, Litz found it was remorse, shame, and guilt from feeling they had failed in some way to act heroically in the face of peril. Yeah. Well, hopefully it went well, Melissa. Evidence based therapies using cognitive behavioral techniques, Litz would later write, do not sufficiently explain, predict, or address the needs of many service members and veterans who are exposed to diverse psychic injuries. He could see the need for a new military specific form of therapy that would take into account the unique culture and ethos of the military and the unique moral stressors that arise when men and women are sent into the kinds of frustrating, ambiguous conflicts he'd studied in the Somalia peacekeeping operation. Something that would enable combat veterans to voice their deepest concerns and receive forgiveness. While Brett Litz was puzzling over this, one of his young colleagues, Shira Magwin, who we've talked about in depth here, was looking for clues in a slightly different direction, linking the moral injury Litz was documenting directly to killing. She found that her PTSD patients frequently mentioned killing as a cause of their distress, killing they had done in combat. Magwin was intrigued, but hardly surprised. She had been born in Israel and was familiar with war. Her parents served in the IDF. Her father had fought in the Yom Kippur War. After college in the United States, she worked with Litz at the Boston VA for 4 years. Using CPT and other similar therapies that sought to extinguish fear based trauma. But what I was seeing, she told me, was not so much of the fear based response, but the struggles that were related to what they did and what we now think of as moral injury, crossing certain boundaries, what they defined for themselves as their own moral values. These were issues, she said, not traditionally captured by treatments of evidence based therapies. What was needed, she determined, was an additional specialized therapy that would address the shame, guilt, and feeling of self contamination that she was seeing in her patients. If someone is carrying around all those cognitions, she said, they can't lead a successful life. I hmm. I don't really know about that, but, you're good, Angel. That is, completely understandable. Um, just somebody remind me after this, and we can talk about, killing and moral injury, yada, yada. Across the country, Michael Castellana had come to the same conclusion. I'd rather be outside with the pups too, but I need to get this done, work and all. Across the country, Michael Castellana had come to the same conclusion that a new model of therapy for war trauma was needed. Michael wasn't a PhD psychologist. He did not have a medical degree in psychiatry. He'd put himself through Brandeis University and earned a master's degree in social work at Boston University. He was the first person in his family to go to college and wasn't able to finally pay off his student loans until he was 44 years old. Shout out to student loans and him. He had done doctoral level training in clinical and pastoral psychotherapy, but his deft touch in working with cases of trauma was intuitive and experiential. What connected him across the worlds of academic, scientific psychology and the gritty reality of people in trauma was his intense personal empathy. It's as if he can see into your soul and understand it. Over breakfast, he told me that he'd been working in private practice in San Diego when the terrorists struck on 9/11 and the United States lurched into war in Afghanistan and then lied about Iraq. I I'll put the parentheses there in the lie. I'm not putting words into this guy's mouth. Michael thought, if this doesn't end quickly, I know what's going to happen. It didn't end quickly. He got in touch with everyone he knew in the military, asking how he could get involved, and eventually came across a job opening at Camp Pendleton for a trauma therapist. He was anxious, late for the interview, but he got the job. I stopped him right there. You're a gay guy with no military experience, and it will be years before gays can serve openly. What made you think you could just walk in there and deal with Marines trauma? It's the same way with the cat TV. The cat TV stays on all the time. He grinned, approaching Pendleton. I was really kind of overwhelmed, he admitted, but I knew trauma. He meant that in a personal way. Turned out to be a long story that unfolded as we dawdled over the remains of our breakfast. And it took us back to Watertown, Massachusetts, where Michael's father, Carmelo, had a barber shop, and his mother, Anna, who loved opera and sang in clubs when she was younger, worked in a car parts factory and sang when she got home at night. Student loans never forgiven unless two scenarios. DTA. Okay, death. After paying off student loans, ask for original promissory note. The service loan provider cannot provide the original promissory note. Loan forgiven. Well, I mean, 10 years public service, yada, yada, stuff like that. After Michael was out of college and working as a therapist, sorry. In 1951, Anna discovered a tumor in her neck. The doctors cut it out, but the operation left one of her vocal cords paralyzed. Mm, that's sad. She could never sing again, but she kept a happy home for her four kids as she could, with what with money worries and long hours at the factory and Carmelo's heavy drinking. After Michael was out of college and working as a therapist, she got sick again. And Michael, then 24, moved home to take care of her. Living in the basement, they were close, really close. When he had gotten a job in California, they had driven together across the country. She used to tell him, smiling, Michael, you have good taste in men. She was a wonderful person, Michael told me. Wonderful. One night, he heard his mother cough in the upstairs bathroom. It was like someone struck a knife in my chest. I could feel this presence, like my mother needs me. Threw my toothbrush down and ran upstairs. My father was standing there dazed, white as a ghost. In the kitchen, trying to buckle his pants, he said, we have to go to the hospital now. I ran to the bathroom where my mother was. He paused. It was like something had slaughtered a pig. She had a carotid blowout. Dang. A rupture of the main artery in her neck, which carries blood from her heart to the brain. She was dying. Michael bowed his head as he remembered the scene. Birds chirped from a nearby bush, and the waitress collected her plates. It was a few moments before he could go home. The cops arrived at the Castellana house carrying a useless little first aid kit. Michael is holding his mother in his arms, blood all over, pleading with the cops. Just get us to the hospital. And outside, there's no ambulance, only the squad car. So they all cram inside. Carmelo, still somewhat drunk, trying to get the driver in a chokehold, demanding they be taken to Mass General. But we're racing to Waltham Hospital. It's closer, and my mother is kind of kicking my father, and I'm trying to push him down, and we're barreling up Main Street, and it's like 2 a.m. and raining. And from a side street, a girl in the station wagon jumps a red light. She sees the police cruiser bearing down on her and freezes. A second later, good grief, the collision. We T-bone her. I think that is the right word. Push her car 60 feet up the road. I watched this in slow motion. It's the first and only time I've had an out of body experience because I'm standing holding my mother in the rain. There's blood all over me, and I see it from up above and behind me. I see the flashing light of the gumball machine from the police cruiser that's knocked off into the street. And this ruffian looking kid in a leather jacket drives by and says, man, you need some help? Ha. And I say, can you get us to the hospital? And the next day, the cop said to me, how did you open the car door? Everything was crushed. And I said, I don't know. I just had to do it. Anna had broken her back in the crash. She lived for a while, but the story wasn't quite done. When we got to the hospital, I got her to the emergency ward, and she looked up at me and she said, "How did you know I called you? I never said a word." In the telling now at breakfast in sunny San Diego, Michael's eyes filled and he bent his head and whispered, "I heard you, Mama." Fuck, that hurt. Michael Castellana knew trauma. At Pendleton, Michael worked for a year, getting more and more frustrated with the existing treatment models. And in 2006, he was asked to join the Deployment Health Center and was given free reign to work with Marines returning from combat. Uh, Dick Dickens, I had Stafford and sub and unsubs, and once I got 100% permanent and total, all my loans were forgiven. Shout out to private colleges and them. What's up, Groovy? One weekend, he sat down and wrote a detailed curriculum for a brief 6-week, 12 session group treatment model designed to help Marines. No, through DOE, there's a program. Oh, yeah. When I got rated 100% permanent total through the VA, I just had to apply through DOE for my loans to be forgiven. Let's see. One weekend, he sat down and wrote a detailed curriculum for a brief 6-week, 12 session group treatment model designed to help Marines relax in a safe environment and begin to understand their trauma, to learn some coping strategies, and through the kind of exposure therapy that Brett Litz was studying in Boston, to begin sharing their trauma memories in a validating group. One session was devoted to a discussion about aggression, what happens when Marines kill, and the addictive quality of adrenaline surges. I will say that the adrenaline surges are something that is addicting and problem causing, especially if you're married and you did, and the Department of Defense has no problem deploying you way outside of normal models, and how different life is at home, given their experience with weapons and authorized force and aggression they enjoyed in combat. Ain't no drug like it. I will tell you that. And finally, the concept of redemption. In his introduction, Michael wrote a caution to therapists who would follow this model. The experts in the room are the ones who are there to do the talking, the sharing. We, the therapists, must listen. We are there to ensure that boundaries are kept clear and honored at all costs. We can help the group members to moderate their pain, monitor their progress, and to pace their journey so that they do not falter and lose face. Preserving their integrity is crucial. These are remarkable, courageous men and women. We should laugh with them, grieve with them, and most of all, empathize and inject human perspective on the terrible experiences these service members have endured. We must bear with them the distressing and challenging events they have lived through and accompany them as they make their way to a new, fuller understanding and appreciation of their role in war and as fellow human beings in the world. It was a sharp break from past therapies. Healing would come not from the work done by the patient and therapist, but would come in a setting created and monitored by the therapist through forgiveness from one's peers. Whenever Michael had a new Marine coming in for therapy, he had a ritual. He'd hand the Marine two of his business cards. One card is for you. Put it in your wallet. And if you need to cancel, call me. The other one, put in your pocket because I know damn well you know someone else who needs to be here. People would come and say to me, my buddy gave me your card, and I've had people come back and ask for more cards. Hey, Misty, they'd given all theirs away. And so I built a practice on my credibility. Marines are tribal, Michael told me. And if you fuck up, it's over because word spreads. But conversely, when you help someone, it lasts a lifetime. Michael also had learned techniques to help morally injured Marines understand that they alone don't have to bear all the responsibility for what happened. One method I found easy to understand can be done in individual counseling. As Michael explained it, he would have the patient list and assign a percentage of responsibility to every person or factor that played a role in the injuring incident. Say if Marine had killed a child, the Marine might assign himself 20%, the kid shooting at him 15, the Taliban who armed the kid and told him to shoot 20, God maybe 30%, and so on. The idea is to help the patient see, even while acknowledging his own role, that he doesn't have to bear 100% of the responsibility. Life can go on. For a long time, I assigned God 100% of it. Um, I was not a God fan. I slipped away from my faith. Then an evil troll brought me back into it. About the only thing good that's come out of that interaction. One day, a Marine sergeant came to see Castiana. He admitted he didn't want to come, but his buddy got a guy Michael had treated. Yeah, through his anti Semitism and hate, had insisted. This sergeant was a tough guy, hard. His marriage was falling apart. He was angry, punching holes in the walls. When he got into the office, Michael said, take off your blouse. The sergeant blinked, but he stood up and stripped off his uniform shirt and sat back down in his olive green t shirt. And they went at it. It took 5 individual therapy sessions. The sergeant was a squad leader, and the squad had been under attack by insurgents, including 2 kids, 11 and 14. And one of the kids shot at the Marine squad, and the sergeant returned fire and killed them both. It was what the military considers a good kill. Back home, the sergeant had an 11-year-old brother, like the boy he'd killed. His guilt was enormous. He couldn't look at his father, Michael said. In telling his story, Michael had to raise his voice over the raucous laughter of a trio of college women at the next table. That was one of his chief complaints when he came in. Didn't want his father to see him. So, in the course of my treatment of him, he was able not only to confess his sin and have me still love him, but to hear as he grieved how sad he was that the Iraqi adults in the situation had made the weapons available to those kids or poisoned them in some way and put them in this untenable situation. That as a Marine, his job was to ensure the safety of his Marines. And he did that, but the cost was a personal one. He couldn't face his father because since he felt like he had just slaughtered his baby brother. Michael helped the sergeant understand that his pulling the trigger was only a small part in the tragedy, that those who armed the kids were also culpable, that those who set up the ambush were at fault as well, that it was a bad thing that had happened, but the sergeant needed to shoulder all the blame and guilt. He could forgive himself. All this took time. Well, that man had one of the most remarkable turnarounds. He went home and he hugged his father and he told his father what happened. And he cried with his father, cried and said, "Oh, thank God I have my son back." Is that not the most beautiful story in the world? That he was able to see that there was no right answer and that no matter what decision he made, it would have consequences. But his heart was pure. And if I saw him today, I would love him just as much. A remarkable man. When word began to circulate about Michael's trauma model, he was asked to travel around the Marine Corps and to talk to groups of Marines about trauma and moral injury and to brief other therapists. Soon his model was widely in use. One day at Pendleton, Michael's phone rang. This this gets back all the way to the beginning of this book. He started off talking about Michael's phone ringing. As Michael later remembered, a voice demanded, "Who the hell are you? I read your model. How do you know all this?" Before Michael could answer, the caller said, "Would you be willing to train people across the country on this?" "Oh, yeah, this is Bill Nash." Nash, the Navy captain and combat psychologist, was working on a new concept with Brett Litz. The idea was to modify the previous generations of exposure therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy and construct a new model specifically designed for moral injury and active duty service members. The demand of the war, they didn't have much time to work with individuals. The Marines and soldiers who needed help needed it fast because they were all were on schedule to deploy again. And anyway, Litz and Nash knew that the goal of actually healing moral injury was unrealistic. What they were aiming for instead was equipping morally injured service members with the knowledge and skills for a lifetime of post traumatic growth. Working together and aided by half a dozen psychologists who had studied under Litz, they came up with a new definition of moral injury. And it is the lasting psychological, biological, spiritual, and social impact of perpetuating failing to prevent or bearing witness to acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. One key insight underlay their new approach. Cognitive behavioral therapy and cognitive processing therapy sought to help the patients correct distorted thoughts and beliefs. Held by combat soldiers and Marines about their transgressions might be painful, but weren't necessarily distorted. Nick Rudolph knew he had killed a child. What needed attention was not distorted beliefs about the act of transgression, but the shame, guilt, and anger of having violated your own moral code. One you share with your peers and family. Michael Castellana's sergeant couldn't face his father because he felt he had betrayed his father's moral values and his own. I don't read your vomit coded. That's disgusting. Need to get your head checked out, bud. But Litz and Nash understood, as Castellana, that if service members felt guilty or shame or sorrow or anger, it means they possessed or an intact set of moral values and they could be listened to and safe and understood and forgiven, eventually healed with a safe and loving community. For moral injured combat veterans who are earnestly seeking care, they wrote in a 2009 article sketching out their ideas. Forgiveness and repair is possible in all cases. It would require sharing the traumatic experience with a group of peers. The method Castellana was implementing at Pendleton, then guiding the patient towards self forgiveness and moving forward. The model Litz and Nash had in mind was intended not to complete the healing process, but to enable patients to get clear about the events that caused their moral injury and to get the skills and resources they would need for a lifelong process of forgiveness and hopefulness. They called this approach adaptive disclosure. In my community, there's been this kind of assumption of the equipotentiality of trauma, Liz told me. He meant treating all trauma as the same thing. Motor accident survivors, one therapy works for them. So let's apply that to service members and veterans. And of course, if you just spend time being curious and learn what wars mean for combatants, you can't help but wonder, what are we missing? Coming up with something new was the obvious next step for me, Lit said. It was a fucking no brainer. As part of their work, Nash developed a moral injury event scale to screen veterans for moral injury and to measure the extent and intensity of the wound. It asked for never, seldom, sometimes, or often responses to statements such as, I saw things that were morally wrong. I am troubled by having witnessed others' immoral acts. I acted in ways that violated my own moral code or values. I am troubled by having acted in ways that violated my own morals or values. Hey, Coded, if you have a problem with how I run my channel, you can report me and see how that works out for you because I've done nothing that violates terms of service. I just create content, buddy. You want me to count yours? Fuck, you had a -3 on yours the other day. -3 Coded. So see your way out. I feel betrayed by leaders I once trusted. I'm not being defensive. I'm talking to somebody I have a true disdain for. It's a difference. I am troubled because I violated my morals by failing to do something I should have done. As in Michael Castiana's therapeutic model, the Litz Nash adaptive disclosure approach. Oh, Sheen, what's up? The Litz Nash adaptive disclosure approach first establishes a warm, supportive environment in which a Marine who is expecting to be condemned for his or her transgressions finds instead acceptance and support. Subsequent sessions reflect the idea of behavior extinction, with the therapist encouraging the Marine to relate his transgression over and over until it loses its potency. It is helpful to have the patient close his or her eyes during the session, Litz and Nash note, but the goal is to create a raw and emotional reliving and recounting to break through whatever avoidance strategies the Marine has put in place. The retelling is repeated often, not to force an extinction of the painful memory, but to begin to break down the expectation of shame and rejection. Eventually, the therapist introduces the patient to positive, corrective judgments about himself, and that is followed by sessions in which the patient is asked to imagine himself as a benevolent figure, a priest or senior officer, giving advice and support to a morally injured service member. This encourages the patient to articulate about the capacity to do good, to engage in service, and accept forgiveness from self and from peers. Finally, the patient begins to make amends with the actual community service, not to try to offer reparations for past behavior, but to reconnect with his positive values. Further sessions teach the patient to carefully seek out positive and healing relationships beyond the therapy room. Because many people do not know what to say about such things. The toe curling stories Castiana has heard, and their reactions may be difficult to predict or interpret. Guidance will be needed, Litz and Nash warn. The therapy ends with extended conversations with the therapist about the lesson the patient can take on into life. Combat veterans with serious trauma and moral injury should be warned that there will be challenging times ahead. In 2009, a group of psychologists working under the direction of Litz and Nash tested out the ideas of adaptive disclosure in 6 sessions with groups of Marines and Navy corpsmen recently returned from war and given the umbrella diagnosis of PTSD. The military has no diagnosis of moral injury then or now. Among the research was Amy Anadon, a Navy psychologist now working at the Naval Medical Center, San Diego. The results were encouraging. The Marines reported sharp reductions in the symptoms of moral injury, depression, and negative views of themselves. We're in a period of discovery, Brett Litz told me on the phone one day. We were talking about next steps, and he was excited. Stunned was the word he used that the Defense Department was looking to award research money for work on moral injury repair. Litz had written a long and dense project proposal for a randomized control trial of adaptive disclosure for moral injury, one that would extend the therapy from 6 to 12 sessions. He looks more like a Mary Kay guy, Boston. Their proposed treatment would include a block of therapy specifically related to moral injury of killing, based on the work of Shira Magwin was doing with her patients in San Francisco. In a program of 6 to 8 sessions, she calls the impact of killing she calls the impact of killing therapy. She explores with patients the emotional and psychological and physiological impacts of killing, then deals directly with self forgiveness. Many veterans are resistant, believing that to forgive is dishonorable, dismissing a wrong they have committed. Eventually, they are asked to write a letter to a person they killed or to their younger self, explaining what they now understand about killing that they did not at an earlier time. Part of self forgiveness is understanding the context in which this happened. Usually, a situation where you are constantly making life and death decisions quickly without having all the information. She said, in 2012, Amy Anadon and Michael Castiana began piecing together all the various strands. The early work Castellano had done, the understanding of PTSD as distinct from emotions of loss, guilt, and shame that are moral injury, and the new techniques of adaptive disclosure. They started working with patients who had been admitted to a PTSD treatment program at the San Diego Naval Hospital in a 10-week program they called the Moral Injury and Moral Repair Group. Patients learned to talk through their experiences with the group. They were directed to write a letter to themselves asking for forgiveness. They were assigned to work in community service projects as a way of rediscovering their altruistic values. The healing mechanism of adaptive disclosure is owning your story. I've done some bad things, and having people hear that and accept you, Hamadon told me one sunny afternoon as we talked in the courtyard of the hospital. In the first week, we introduced the idea of moral repair, the idea of doing things that in your heart you know are good and kind and bring you closer to the person you want to be. Coded, if I want to read every other word and read a comment, I can. It's my channel. Shut the fuck up. And I'll continue to let the chat just clown on you. All right, Dale. Be good. Disillusionment with the war is a major emotion that Marines bring into the sessions. Why did we sacrifice so much? Seeing buddies getting hurt and killed. Why did we do so much killing? Only to see that things in Iraq and Afghanistan are actually much worse, helping them make their own story to accommodate that. The idea that, why am I doing this? What is the point of the world? World is an evil place. When you have to do something horrible, the difficulty is making any meaning out of it, Hamadon says. Faith comes up in every session. Why did God let this happen? She and her small staff do what they can in 10 weeks, but it's discouraging, she allowed. I know the military has to create aggressive, antisocial, callous people. And the younger ones have this attitude that they're going on one deployment and they will come back the same person that left. But they won't. Should we harden them? She asked, repeating the question I had asked. No, we should not. But we should be doing better job of mentally preparing them for things like kids shooting at them and the woman with the bomb under her burqa. That's something the military misses in preparing them for war. Why am I doing this? The San Diego program is the only government initiative I could find that specifically addresses moral injury. There is nothing like it in all of the Defense Department's medical facilities or at the VA. Beyond the kinds of research that Shira Magwin and a few others are doing, and some individual VA therapists who provide moral injury therapy. In fact, the world of those working with war related moral injury is exceedingly small. Many of the published research on moral injury, for instance, list the same people: Bill Nash and Brett Litz, Amy Amadon, Matt Gray of the University of Wyoming, NYU clinical psychologist Maria Steenkamp, Matthew Friedman of the VA's National Center for PTSD, Richard Westfall, a former Navy psychiatric nurse, and a few others. It's only us, Litz told me. It's a small world. In December 2014, the Department of Veterans Affairs signed a $16 million contract with IBM to install software at the VA's data center in Austin, Texas, that the VA said would assist its doctors and therapists confused about how to treat patients diagnosed with PTSD. VA staff can plug in clinical data and electronic medical records, and the computer will spit out the appropriate treatment plan. Pretty disgusting that we're just typed into a computer and they just spit out diagnoses or treatment plans. Despite this step toward the mechanization of war trauma therapy, I was impressed that even a small group of researchers was doing such innovative work on healing strategies for moral injury, and mildly pleased that the VA, even the Pentagon, were willing to fund research and clinical trials. Yeah, enhance, enhance. Still, I couldn't help noticing an almost complete disconnect between the enthusiasm of researchers like Brett Litz and Bill Nash and the many soldiers and Marines I have talked to who came back after their combat tours and got no help whatsoever. One who did get help was Darren Doss, the Marine from Charlie 1-6. In the spring of 2015, several months before I took him to lunch in Schenectady, Doss was arrested after a traffic altercation. In court, he was offered the choice of jail or the VA's PTSD clinic. He chose the latter. I know a ton of dudes who should be here, he told me at the time. The reason they aren't is pride. I related this to Bill Nash one day, saying that it seemed to me that despite all the research being done, not much of it was in reaching the people who needed it the most. And something else that had been nagging at me. Some people I knew, like Nick Rudolph and Stephen Canty and Stacy Pearsall, came back from war with deep moral injuries, and they seemed to be doing okay. Perhaps healing slowly, and perhaps just stuffing all the pain down inside. Canty said once that he tries to distance himself from the war. I meditate, do yoga. I think that's both forms of therapy are uh, very good choices to do on your own. We don't believe in human sacrifice here, Coded. Try to find peace with what happened in the war and to who I am as a human being. I try not to be defined by that 4 year period in my life and the 15 months I spent in Afghanistan. I can't let that guilt consume me. It occurred to me, though, that even guys like Canty, who seem to be doing okay, would benefit from the best healing techniques that the mental health professions have learned. It occurred to me, though, that even guys like Canty, who seem to be doing okay, would benefit from the best healing techniques that the mental health professions have learned about moral injury since 2001. But there appeared to be no connection between therapists and veterans to enable that to happen. Nash sighed deeply. It's more than that. It's something else. We don't even have good treatments. We simply don't. We'd met on a summer Sunday at an Asian restaurant in McLean, Virginia, and we're waiting for the Mongolian beef and fried rice. Dang, that makes me hungry. Nash had just read a disturbing paper by Brett Litz and his colleague Maria Steenkamp that had studied 36 major clinical trials of therapy for PTSD among active duty troops and veterans conducted between 1980 and 2015. They concluded that the most widely used therapies for PTSD, CPT, and prolonged exposure were only marginally effective. A lot of my a lot of my friends lived in McLean and Tyson's Corner uh, because of where everybody worked. Their paper, published in the Journal of American Medical Association in the summer of 2015, reported that between one third and one half of patients receiving CPT or PE did not demonstrate clinically meaningful symptom change. Two-thirds of those receiving therapy still had symptoms of PTSD afterward. Contrary to earlier assurances of their effectiveness, PE therapy tested in one large clinical trial did not lead to meaningful PTSD symptom reduction, they reported. In other cases, alternative therapies such as acupuncture, I love acupuncture, or healing touch, which involves tapping specific points on the body while being guided through positive imagery, were just as effective. I did acupuncture uh, with the positive imagery therapies. Those were pretty good. I found this outrageous. The only therapies widely available in the United States government for combat veterans were ineffective. We sent people into war, and when they came home with moral injury, either they were ignored or they were diagnosed with PTSD and given therapy that didn't help. How could this happen? Huh. The government. The VA had officially endorsed both CPT and PE for treatment back in 2008, based largely on studies of traumatized civilians, suggesting these therapies were effective. But they weren't. Why? Perhaps Litz and Steenkamp wrote, because war trauma is fundamentally unlike civilian trauma. Among those differences, they noted, were the extended, repeated, and intense nature of deployment trauma, and the fact that service members are exposed not only to life threats, but to traumatic losses and morally compromising experiences that may require different treatment approaches. They also noted that veterans dropped out of the therapy sessions at a higher rate than civilians. Amen. Phil Nash also found all this eye opening. So, with no treatment at all, some people are going to get better. Some will stay the same. Some will get worse, he concluded. Those who got therapy fared about the same. Nash paused to tuck hungrily into his beef and then went on. What I look at to make sense of all this, is for those who get better, what is the effect size of the treatment? How much better do they get? Effect size, he explained, is measured statistically by how far the results of a clinical trial deviate from the expected outcome expressed as a standard deviation. The mean result might be, for instance, a control group that got no therapy, and a good result would be to achieve several standard deviations beyond that mean. So, an effect size of 1.0 means you have lowered the mean by the exact one standard deviation, Nash said. So, one is really a small change. In the rest of medicine, that would be considered a failure. In the rest of medicine, you would not spend money on blood pressure medicine if in the population it lowered blood pressure by one standard deviations, right? So the effect sizes for cognitive behavioral therapies, prolonged exposure, CPT, the ones that are most studied in rape populations, is about 1.3. And in combat veterans, 1. In the 2011 pilot study that Litz and Nash did using adapted disclosure, we had a 1.3, which is better than a 1. But how much better do we make the world? And then how much better is that than they would have gotten if we had done yoga or taken them fishing or horseback riding? Anything else in the world, it's not compelling. I got asked to be part of a group that they take people trout fishing for therapy. I turned it down for somebody who I felt needed it more. I it would be cool to go on though. Let's see. And the risk of adverse outcomes is not known, Nash said. Prolonged exposure therapy can cause people to react violently. For instance, but there's no data on adverse outcomes for exposure therapy. Over the years, working in inpatient units in psychiatry, I've had many people who just lost it, gone crazy in exposure treatment for some trauma, he said. People know this at a gut level and they hear someone who had a bad experience, but the rates are we have no freaking idea. We never looked. I can tell you one person who freaking lost their freaking mind after exposure therapy. Um, so I'll get to it. Uh, there's also a shortage of data of understanding about people who get better naturally without treatment. What are the predictors of getting better? Was it a spouse that could tolerate hearing the stories? These are the anecdotes that I hear all the time. Guys say, "What saved my life was my wife hearing all the things that I did and telling me I love you anyway, and convincing them that they deserve to be loved." How many got better because they found God and forgiveness in a church? How many because of peer support? How much of it was because they did the things we all do to heal from moral injuries? I mean, moral injuries have been around for as long as humans, right? What are the cultural ways of responding to that? You make amends, you seek amends, you try, if you have created evil, to create good. Nash paused as our server cleared away the plates. While adaptive disclosure and Magwin's impact of killing therapy. What's up, Joey? Hold great promise. He said he thought the ultimate answers may lie elsewhere. You have these treatments that are really not hugely better than nothing at all. And because, of course, side effects, there's a chance they may make you worse. For combat veterans who are badly broken, he added, you do need mental health intervention to get them to sleep, to reduce the arousal level, manage suicide risk. But if you ask my totally shoot from the hip opinion, I don't think psychotherapists will ever be the solution for moral injury. Dr. Harold Cudler, the VA's chief mental health consultant, sighed deeply when I called to ask him about this. Science tells us that prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy are treatments that work for PTSD, he said, and added quickly, when they are the right treatment for that person. I love how the science says, I'll tell you a secret, Joey. It's those cat shorts really help my subs and my crane shorts. But I'm thinking that shorts really knock it out of the park. Let's see. What we're less good at is deciding who's the right person for what type of therapy. It's not the therapy that's wrong, it's the goodness of the fit. That just does not make any sense. Um, I think the VA has a lot of work to do, and it'll take a lot of years to do it well. To establish a sound method of determining the goodness of fit for any of our therapies, we need science behind that. When I when I asked if that kind of research is underway, he sighed again. Unfortunately, many people are so invested in their models that they have trouble stepping back to also consider the individual they are working with. None of these therapies, he added, is designed to fit moral injury. I do think we don't consider the moral injury aspect of this as much as we could or should. Some would argue that it's not the place of clinical people, that we're not chaplains or oracles. That's an unsatisfactory answer in the 21st century. It's in our province to do something about it, or at least to recognize it and an approach to it. Cat swapping cats works. That confirmed a conviction that had been growing since I began studying moral injury. True healing of veterans with war related moral injuries will only come from community. However, we and they define community: peers, neighbors, neighborhoods, faith, congregations, service organizations, individuals. That means it's up to us. Let's see. That will do it for today. I know I said last week we would probably finish it last week, but I got busy. You know, as some people with happy families, you know who you are. I know we can't see you now. Um, I was with my girls a lot last week, so I will take that. And I am sure that HPS will be on tonight. Um, Anywho, any question? Oh, I was going to talk about. Um, so the Magwin about killing and that being the hardest um, thing on veterans, combat veterans, and it makes me think that it depends on the kind of killing. A grown man um, coming after you is one thing. A grown man, and then you find pictures of him and his kids. Um, that makes it harder uh, to deal with sometimes. Um, it it does haunt your sleep. If you've had to target a hospital or school because there it has been militarized, um, I'm talking anti-aircraft, artillery, storage of weapons and ammunition in them. Um, that's another kind. You know, it's going to save lives, but you save lives at what cost, and what cost to your soul. Um, like I said, you know, I blamed God for a long, long time, and I did it for a long, long time. I deployed in '02. I did some TDYs in '01 in support to build the machine. Um, and I didn't stop completely until 14. Um, I will say that some kinds of it will haunt you, and other kinds you're fine with. I don't know. I don't know what that makes me, but I'm here with my family. I know I've come to accept that now. I'm functioning, not drinking myself to sleep at night. So So I don't know if I can I don't know if I completely agree with her assessment that that's the worst thing. That killing is the worst thing. I think it again falls to the type. Yeah, yeah, that's what bugged me about the hospital and school because I knew they were using children as shields, and the man with his wife and kids, or with his kids. I'm sorry, but when people wonder why we get a little upset with stolen valor idiots online trying to make money off of it. Whether they say they got purple hearts or they say they got uh, they they had valorous service. Um, we kind of get eel. So anyway, we'll be figuring out when we're gonna go on tonight. Uh, just for transparency, I muted coded because my blood pressure was getting up, and I really didn't want to deal with his bullshit. He's just timed out. Um, I normally don't, but he's a bitch. Yeah, he did. He did, Joey. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm at other places where this was to serve a purpose, and sidetracking, sidetracking the chat here is kind of different. Well, I mean, make me big. Oh no. Hang on. Sorry about that. All right, y'all. I am gonna be a stylish hoodie pop up. What's up, Justin? Kinetic bombardment. All right, y'all. I will see y'all later tonight. Oh, hang on. I'll back there. Let me kill this. Sleeping like a baby. Aw, shit, son. I'm just going in settings. I save a picture that Nomad did for me, and see, I can do. This is one of my pictures. Oh no, it's not. It's not a green screen at all. It's just my wall. Just that. It's an evergreen playing Mrs. Metcalf. It had nothing to do with the agency. Never. All you got to all you got to do is have Google to know I'm telling the absolute truth. Thank you, thank you. The ice cream man's outside. All right, y'all. I'll talk to y'all later. Thank you, Joey.